Well, thanks so much, Steve. Before I dig into the actual content, I just really wanted to give a big thank you to a few people. Number one, the Philadelphia Union, who've been so supportive through much of my research project and also just in my career. They've given me a lot of great opportunities. So thank you to them. And then inside of my own staff, the Philadelphia Union Performance Department, which stretches from our academy all the way up to our first team. They tend to get the brunt of my stress and also the brunt of my questions and follow-ups. And so I have to give them a big shout out and thank you for all the work that they put in to help me with this process. Steve and the Playermaker group, thank you for inviting me and thank you for putting this on. I've been on all day and it's been a fantastic opportunity to learn and share with some of the panelists, which I was fortunate enough to be on a WhatsApp group with. And Steve, really, really nice job. You've essentially taken a bibliography from your favorite research paper and gotten everyone to speak on it. So it's really fun to see. The last group is my advisory group at Teesside University, Greg Atkinson, Paul Chesterton, and Matt Wright. They've been great through this entire process and asked me the tough questions and pushed me really hard, and it's been fun to work with. So I'll dive into a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. My really brief background. Currently, I serve as the Director of Performance for the Philadelphia Union, which means I oversee the medical, sports science, strength and conditioning, psychology, nutrition for our entire club, which spans from our youth academy starting at 12 all the way through to our first team. And there's a lot of interesting pieces to it, along with our in-house school, which has been a great asset. And so that's been a big piece of it. A large majority of my career has been spent in the MLS. And so I've been able to experience a lot of this topic from different coasts and different standpoints. And so I felt this was a really interesting topic to dive into. So as we look at sort of the purpose of my research, and also a main driver in my day-to-day work is to continue to evaluate current practices in elite soccer, more specifically the Philadelphia Union, and understand how environmental stressors may play a part in athlete performance and their perception of performance. And what's interesting is when I started my PhD process, this wasn't the topic that we were initially going for. Much of the wording that we were sort of looking at was creating metrics and developing ways that we can better understand training load. Reading the work of Dan Weaving, Tim Gabbett, Billy Hulin, Orchard, and many others really inspired me to think about how we can better utilize our data to portray what's happening on the field. And through discussing with my advisory group, we sort of decided to take a shift, and that's where the environmental piece of this project sort of comes in. And now what we're starting to do is ask practical questions and say, what are issues that we're running into with the Philadelphia Union? What can we do to help? And so a major one is contending with some of the environmental stressors which pop up for our athletes throughout the day or throughout the year. So as you know, the MLS in the United States is a vast ecosystem. Within the MLS, we cover about 3 million square miles of area, spanning from Montreal, Quebec, all the way to LA, everything in between. When we start looking at some of the different logistical issues that we run into, Philadelphia actually probably has it the easiest, if not one of the easiest logistically in the league, due to the fact that geographically we're close to New York, which has 2 teams. We're close to DC. Those are actually bus trips for us. There's many teams in the league that never get to hop on a bus other than to go to the airport. So we're really lucky there that we can be so close and have some easier trips in there. We have 3 or 4 trips that are only hour plane rides, which is nice, but then everything else starts getting up over the 90 minutes to 2 hours. A couple weeks ago, before our league shutdown, we made the trip to LA, which is a 2,389-mile flight, and that's just for a single regular season game. That was actually fairly easily logistically because we had an 8-day lead up. So we were able to take some time, get there, get recovered and not feel too awful and rushed during that process. There are other times during the season where that's not the case. In the 2019 season, as you can see by some of those blue arrows, we bounced around a little bit. Now, these 3 trips that you see all occurred in a 10-day span. So we flew to Montreal, flew back to Philadelphia. We flew to San Jose, flew back to Philadelphia, and then we flew to Columbus, Ohio, which is obviously a difficult trip to have to do with soccer matches interspersed. Along with the difficulty of travel logistics, we have 2 cities in our league which are both over 4,000 feet of elevation, in Salt Lake City, Utah, and in Denver, Colorado. And the other interesting piece that we always get to deal with, especially as we get into June, July, and August, is the heat. And now for much of the country, temperatures can vary anywhere from 70 degrees Fahrenheit all the way up to 100 plus degrees Fahrenheit. And so we deal with that logistic frequently during the middle and sometimes the busiest part of our season. Why is travel so important to us? Now, through an analysis of our league, we found that there's sort of a minimum standard that every team needs to reach to make the playoffs. Now, the playoffs start in October, but that road takes a long time to get to. And what we found is essentially every team that makes the playoffs has at least 3 road wins during the season, which doesn't sound too difficult. There were only 3 teams in the database that we sort of ran that had less than 3 road wins during a playoff berth. The other interesting data point is the average number of points you're required to qualify for the playoffs on the road is 0.91 points per game. So essentially a tie per road trip is the bare minimum to get into the playoffs. Now, that still doesn't sound like a really difficult process, but when you start looking at the records of road teams, you can find that home teams tend to win 60 to 65% of the matches in the MLS, which is much higher than the league standards, which at the time of this presentation, I wasn't able to find the great graphic that I had seen, but it's one of the higher by 10 to 15 percentage points. Another major discussion, obviously, in roster management is squad rotation, which is a great concept to discuss in theory, but when coaches' jobs are on the line, wins are what are most important. And what we found in our league is that there's a very strong correlation. It's an R value of 0.78 between the number of, or the percentage of minutes played by your top 14 players and the number of points your team accumulates throughout a season. And so that graph over on the left side of the screen right now depicts the 2019 season, and teams that had really high percentage of minutes played by their top 14 players, meaning they didn't make a lot of squad rotation, and teams that maybe rotated more frequently. There is an anomaly here. If we look at it, the league champion was the Seattle Sounders. And so that's one that maybe falls outside of the norm. But when we start looking at a lot of these teams up here in the top portion of this graph, they're teams that made the playoffs, had fairly strong seasons, but also didn't do a lot of squad rotation. When we look to the EPL, down here on the right is the 2017-2018 data. We found that some of the overachievers for that season, Bournemouth, Huddersfield, Burnley, did not do a lot of rotation during their seasons, which was interesting for us, as it sort of showed that other leagues are also focusing on their top players and trying to ensure that they're leveraging them and optimizing their performances throughout the season. So one of the projects we began to work on, and throughout this entire presentation, you're going to see citations down at the bottom. This one's actually a direct citation, something that we stole, but other ones are more, I guess they were more jumping off points for myself and our research team with some of these ideas. And a lot of the names are going to be very familiar from our speaking lineup. There's a lot of people that spoke today that are also showing up on these and really driving some great questions through their research. But Robertson and Joyce did a really great project on evaluating the team's schedule and figuring out where are difficult periods in the season, where are easier periods, and how might it be leveraged in decision making. And so we adapted this model a little bit and tried to guide our decision making a little bit. And what we found to be really important was the 14-day schedule for both our team and the team that we were playing against. Temperature, we were using average temperature, and we tried to build this model leading into the season so then we can be a little more proactive in the process of making decisions about travel, making decisions about how we might invest a little bit more, whether it be time or financially, in helping with the result. At the end of the season, we were able to do a little bit of an analysis of how our model lined up with our results, and there was very little lineup. Some of our most difficult away matches, specifically one on July 11th in Houston, Texas, which is known to be terribly hot, showed up as one of our hardest games to travel to. It also shows up sort of a view of that model and some of our practical applications. It can be seen up in the top right corner of the screen. But that showed up as one of our hardest games of the season. We went into Houston and won that match, which was an incredible feat for that season because Houston only lost 2 games in their stadium that season. But then other games which were valued at much lower, we may not have had such great results. And so the discussion then comes, is the model a predictive model? Absolutely not. But it gave us an idea of maybe where we should invest more or where we should spend more time thinking, or maybe it's one that we talk about, like, do we manage to squat a little bit there and make those decisions? So this was a model that we utilized more to help make decisions on the next steps. So turning back to sort of the research question and some of the ideas that we are trying to answer, I think a major piece was to show some of the methodology behind where our information is coming from and what we plan to do with it. And so we've broken our flowchart down a couple of times now to see where our information really comes from. And in our training and game data, we have multiple sources of information, CATAPULT being one of our major external load measures, as well as both Second Spectrum and Chiron Hago, which we've utilized in different years to sort of build some of that information. Heart rate, now with CATAPULT's integrated heart rate measures, we don't rely on our puller straps as much, but puller has been a huge help in that process. And then with a lot of our subjective data, as Sean may have alluded to, we have a couple of different ways that we're tracking that through wellness and differential RPE. And we're utilizing a bot essentially to ask our athletes more in the comfort of their own phones, essentially, what type of information or the type of information that we want to know. From the testing side, utilizing a lot of different movement screens, blood markers, and on-field assessments to guide our decision-making, and also in the assessment process, understanding what our athletes look like. Are they more anaerobically based? Are they more aerobically based? And deciding how we can better individualize their programming. And then most importantly for this discussion was a lot of our metadata, which comes from Weather Underground, which uses the National Weather Service's data, and the MLS website, and our own internal session planning website, which gives us a lot of insight into the type of training that we're doing throughout the week. Good. So as we dive into some of our subjective measures, these are actual views of our differential RPE and our wellness surveys as the players would see them. And we try and make it as foolproof as possible. We have Spanish versions, we have French versions, we have English versions, all built so the players can understand and utilize this information. And Sean did a really great job of giving in the afternoon session for the UK, Sean McLaren did a great job of sort of giving the base level of information on these 2 types of scales, specifically differential RPE. And now what we're trying to do is leverage this information in our decision-making process. Typically, this is more the wellness stands more as a triage process. As they're filling in these reports, I'm able to get quick feedback and guide my discussions as to how we might want to manage an athlete, and also how do we want to help this athlete in the process as well. So now we'll dive into a little bit more of the topic that we wanted to chat about, which was some of the environmental conditions that we run into. One of the first ones that's always interesting to me is dealing with the heat in these situations. And throughout the season, there's times where it's miserably cold and there's times where it's miserably hot. And one of the really interesting pieces here is performance is really driven by a lot of that. But I think the really important piece to remember before we dive into heat or any of these environmental factors is soccer is such a variable sport. The performances vary so much, and it's not going to be one factor that decides it. There's going to be a lot. The teams you're playing, and as you can see from a lot of these graphs, there isn't a clean line. A lot of them have some big spikes and some dips. So this isn't a perfect science, but we're able to get some really great trends out of this that really drive the way that we're thinking. So when we're dealing with heat and temperature in general, what we found is most of the measures have sort of a sweet spot. With work rate, it tends to be a little bit cooler. With high-speed running efforts, there tended to be a little bit of a shift right on the scale to be a little bit warmer where those values were optimized. And what we found was with this data, with the objective data, these measurement tools were really helpful in sort of saying, what can we expect out of the athletes in terms of performance? Looking back at some of the other information we're collecting, wellness surveys being one particularly useful piece of information in this context. What we found was for every 10 degrees decrease in temperature, wellness increased anywhere from 0.2 to 1.5 total wellness points. So the sum of all of our wellness subscores combined together. And essentially what that's telling us is in a normal week, as we build for a match, it takes about 3 days from our hardest training session to get our game day wellness score. And in that time, we gain anywhere from 3 to 5 wellness points from that hardest session to kickoff. So if we look at that now in the context of this, for every 10 degrees of change, we can expect an increase, or for every 10 degrees decrease, we can expect anywhere from 0.2 to 1.25 points increase. So if we're playing in a match that's 10 to 15 degrees warmer, or in the 60 to 70 degree mark, we can expect that those wellness scores can improve. Good. So when we start looking at the physiology of heat, we really start talking about this equation here, the heat storage equation. And what we're trying to do now is, with our wellness scores, with a lot of our performance data, understand what are the metrics or what are the points in the equation that are really important in improving these responses. How can we shift that curve to the right, to the left a little bit more? How can we improve maybe the tolerance to these loads? And so this is a really important piece here, because we're starting to look at what are those metrics that we can manage? What are those things that we can manage as a staff to really help our athletes perform better in each of these situations? Again, from the physiologic standpoint, we see arousal, that neuromuscular activation drops with exercise hyperthermia and heat in general. RPE may go up. All these issues are things that we want to help our athletes with. And the great saying that I always I turn back to is, as much as we want to say physiology is the key component, I've heard it said by many great strength and conditioning coaches, psychology drives physiology. And so when athletes are starting to perceive things as being more difficult or responding to things in a different way, we as practitioners need to have our alarm bells on and start asking the question of how can we resolve it, or how can we improve those responses? Is it a fitness issue or is it an acute issue? These are all questions that we as practitioners need to start asking to really enhance the athletes' performances. Shifting on from heat to altitude, this is an interesting piece of work that we've conducted inside of our own research group, with some of the results here on the screen. And utilizing wellness and differential RPE, we found a really interesting phenomena. During this period, during this 2-week period, we spent 5 days at altitude. That was 5 nights at altitude. And what we found was throughout the entire database, and specifically inside of this 14-day period, when we were at sea level, differential or RPE for legs, so how hard was the training session for my legs, remained the highest differential score that we saw. So that would be higher than our differential RPE for breathing. So what we saw here was at sea level, the differential RPE for legs was higher than differential RPE for breathing. As we move into our altitude training sessions and our altitude match, what we found was that relationship switched. Now differential RPE for breathing goes higher than the differential RPE for legs. The training loads here are not significantly different as we go throughout a week at sea level and a training week at altitude. And that's reflected here in the wellness scores. Players are not responding to this any differently. They're not waking up feeling differently. They aren't perceiving any of these things to be more difficult anywhere from 12 to 16 hours out from the session. But during the session, they're perceiving that this workload is different at the central level. So at the metabolic and at the cardiovascular level, they're sensing that this session is different. That's also reflected in our heart rate values, which also showed there was an increase in average heart rate and time spent in the top 2 heart rate bands during this altitude period. So when we start looking at the physiologic background of altitude exposure, obviously this slide pertains more to some of the performance benefits of training at altitude. But in this case, where we were only training for 4 days at altitude, our hope was to alleviate much of the stressors that come from altitude leading into the match. And so we actually are looking at this period sort of in between the arrows of these improved performance qualities, such as muscle buffering capacity increase. Obviously, the EPO happens fairly quickly when we go into altitude, but the red blood cell production can take a little bit longer. So we're looking essentially in this area here, and how can we eliminate the detrimental effects of altitude on our athletes and their performances. When we start looking through the literature, obviously there's some great research studies that dive into how does altitude affect performance. And this is a really interesting study where they take rugby players who are native to lowland sea level altitude, and they bring them into an altitude situation. Now this is an interesting testing battery, as they're able to test them at sea level, this blue bar, 6 hours following arrival at altitude, 18 hours post-arrival, and 47 hours post-arrival. This chart here shows average heart rate during a 5-minute submaximal bike test. And what we saw is average heart rate values increase greatly during this time. That same phenomena was seen during our own testing throughout the first couple of days. Even into the 3rd day of training, we saw elevated heart rate values along with elevated differential RPE breathing scores, while still not seeing any change in wellness or any of our training metrics. Good. As alluded to earlier in the presentation, Air travel is going to be another difficulty of the MLS. Any given week, you can spend anywhere from 2 to 6 hours in an airplane one way preparing for a match. This graph here above shows some of the within subject responses to airline travel and their wellness scores the day after traveling in an airplane. For many of our individuals who have been in the league for 5-6 years, they sort of have a slightly decreased value as the time in the airplane increases. But as we see with this individual here, this green line, this was a new athlete to the league, and they really struggled with the 6 hours in the airplane. Anytime we had to go in an airplane, and especially as we moved on being in an airplane for longer. These within subject variations are very interesting. How do we help the individual who may not be prepared for it or have never experienced having to get off an airplane, being given 24 hours and then playing a match? These are interesting conversations to have, and I think one of the biggest things that we've done in our club is have the conversation and prepare them for the shock value and prepare them for what are some of the responses we can have and some of the things that we can do to really help them prepare for that match. But these are all conversations that we have sort of on an individual basis. So interesting information. There's a lot of great companies out there that are doing some interesting things as it pertains to preparing for long distance trips on the circadian rhythm level, which we'll talk about next. There's also some interesting products in tracking how you could shift your time, things like that. But at the air travel side, one of the major issues that people run into is the pressure and the relative humidity of the cabin. And what has been shown through some research is that the relative humidity of an airline cabin can be anywhere from 5 to 15%. So hydration is a really important factor as we talk about airline travel. And then the other interesting piece, when we look at some of the detrimental effects of altitude, the cabin pressure would be equal to being at the same height as Machu Picchu, which is about 7,900 feet, so slightly above Denver, Colorado, which wouldn't be an optimal condition for recovery, which is something that we really need to consider as we're building our protocols and assessing all of our data that we're collecting with these environmental factors in mind. Good. Finally, one of the other major conditions that we run into in the MLS it could be anywhere from a weekly to a monthly time period is time zone shifting. In the MLS, there's 4 separate time zones. There's Eastern time zone, the East Coast, all the way out to the Western time zone with LA and the Californias and the Pacific Northwest. And what our trend lines found is that wellness, while it's not a very strong increase, improved slightly or decreased as we went further away from our home time zone. So being on the East Coast, 0 would be our home time zone here, and -3 would be the West Coast for us. And what we found was that athletes reported lower wellness scores when we spent time in those different time zones. Looking at the physiologic standpoint of circadian rhythm shifting, it was shown that as we move around in our different time zones, it would change the level of alertness that we have, all really important factors in the performance of our athletes and also just the perceived well-being of our athletes. Now, this leads us to our final question, and an important one for all of us, which is, where should we be looking next? It's been alluded to throughout the day today, some of the really important factors that we have to have and sort of have to navigate throughout our job as sports scientists is what data is important. One of our initial studies in my PhD project is evaluating what's the actual data that's important. Through principal component analysis, we've sort of decided that we're tracking too many variables. What we found is we can probably break down a lot of the information that we are collecting through our wellness surveys, which started as a 7-question survey, break it down into maybe a 2 or 3 question survey. I know Robin Thorpe and some of his research also showed that we can probably pull away some of the noise of our questions and ask some more direct questions and get some really great information out of wellness surveys. As we start digging into our GPS and heart rate measures, again, we need to ask those questions of what's important. We can probably break down, I know in any of our given CSV files for Catapult, we have hundreds of different metrics that might be important, might not be important. When we're speaking to our coaching colleagues, speaking with our physiotherapists, the amount of information that you can share and need to share are very different. And so making those decisions as practitioners and sharing the information that's most important and keeping it consumable is really important to all of us. Another important relationship, which we saw in one of our original papers, was the phase of season and how that affects this data. And what we found was that wellness, differential RPE, these 2 metrics specifically had some seasonal variations. During preseason, there wasn't a great correlation between wellness scores and a lot of our objective measures of training load. As we moved into the season, and there was maybe a little bit better flow in terms of the type of training sessions that we were running, the volume of training sessions that we were running, then that wellness data became a little more pertinent. Same thing with differential RPE. During the preseason, players may not be fit or fully fit yet, so we did tend to see a little bit of a change, again, in that ratio of the legginess score and the breathlessness score. And as the players sort of gained fitness and were improving their preparation for the season, those values sort of changed back and legginess took over as sort of the leader in the differential RPE surveys. Talking about dose response relationships, and I even think within subject variation sort of falls into this category, we begin to start asking what does the individual need to know? How can we help the individual? Because that's where a lot of our work should be heading in the next years, is how do we help the individual? How do we help a young player sort of coming into the league? How do we help the older player keep holding on to his career as a professional athlete or professional soccer player? One of the really interesting pieces that we found with some of the subjective data was throughout the season, we track our differential RPE scores, which were legginess, breathlessness, which we've talked about, and a technical score. And the way that I've really talked about the technical score with our athletes is how challenging was a session on my brain. For our older guys, that score stayed solid throughout the season. On Fridays, the day before a game, that technical score drops off. They're sort of in coast mode. And then we had some challenging sessions where it might go up a little bit. For our younger guys, as the season moved on throughout the year, that technical score starts to step up and up and up. And so what we needed to do as a staff and as a club to protect these players is really help them in reducing the amount of information that may be coming to them or changing the way they need to make decisions. And it might be sort of reiterating, these are your responsibilities as a player. These are the things that you need to be doing on a daily basis, and really making sure we pull them into our circle of focus throughout the season. So a lot of this information has been really helpful in sort of guiding our decision-making processes and helping in making decisions on travel, how we might manage a situation from the environmental or travel aspects, or working with our athletes in the preparation and maintenance phases of the season and deciding what are important pieces, how might we change a session to reflect some of their responses, and then make decisions from there. So that's the end of my talk. I'm